All right, well, thank you very much for having me speak. It's very much a pleasure to speak, and especially to speak after Dr. Levine. And I will be touching on a lot of the aspects of the self that he more or less touched on indirectly. But just a little background, I'm a developmental psychopathologist, so I do a lot of more research-based work in personality and clinical psychopathology. And some of my work has begun to touch on the role of social media and how this is impacting the gender identity crisis. And so what I'm going to try to do today is try to tie together a few strands from the clinical aspects of gender identity issues to how social media is amplifying so much of this and leading to even more identity issues. And so what I want to do first is just give a little broad background into personality psychology and historical context, because really personality is about the sense of self. And so you can see a couple of different early theorizers and philosophers who talked about the individual person as both a cause and a consequence of society. And they spoke to the inner unity of individual life, or unity in wholeness. And I want you to think about that in terms of the sense of self. And what I think goes wrong or goes awry in a lot of gender identity issues, as well as some of these other identities that are coming into sort of being, one of which I'll talk about at the end, called Plurals, or this dissociative identity disorder stuff, is a lack of a sense of self-unity. And there's various reasons that might come about, and I'm going to talk about those towards the end in sort of a developmental framework. So personality psychology becomes an identifiable discipline in the 30s, of course, and some historical background into personality psych as a discipline itself. But self-identity is kind of more or less really what the focus is on in personality. So its origins, of course, are in psychodynamic and object relations theories. It's a cohesive identity that comprises a realistic body image, which, of course, has relevance to gender identity, subjective self-sameness, consistent attitudes, temporality, gender authenticity, and ethnicity. So these are core components of self-identity, and a lot of what seems to go a little bit off the rails with gender identity disturbance. And so what I want to make the case to you today is that this is really a personality issue in most of all the gender identity stuff, with the exception of maybe a very small portion who are your classic gender dysphoric individuals. So identity is the psychological structure seen to self-organize or organize the self and interpersonal functioning. And a lot of what we see in gender identity disturbance is sort of a maladaptive, to borrow Dr. Levine's term, way of interpersonal relating aside from the niche and other gender identity disturbed individuals. So identity diffusion is what happens in the normal process when identity becomes sort of diffused or problematic. In normal identity formation or identity consolidation, where you have a very organized and coherent sense of self, you have a stable, coherent, realistic sense of self that's continuous across time. And one of the most famous or most well-known object relations psychodynamic theorists, Otto Kernberg, describes identity diffusion as a poorly integrated or fragmented and unstable sense of self. So individuals who are experiencing identity diffusion may struggle with deep confusion about their own identity and may even feel a sense of non-existence. And I think clinically, I'm not a clinician, but this is what a lot of clinicians report, is that gender identity disturbed individuals feel non-existent. They don't feel like they're in their right body. And so what this really reflects is a sense of identity diffusion. A couple of papers that I'll show you, and I want to just make the statement, you'll see a lot of these papers come up in the slides. Don't worry about focusing on the individual papers, you're free to reach out to me, but I did want to give a little bit of background into the mechanics and the theorizing that has led to sort of the current formulations of identity diffusion and where sort of the anchoring of my presentation is coming from. So here's Kernberg, and he talks in on the right side there. He's answering a question from another researcher. So he refers to ego boundaries, as the term classically refers to the separation between the experience of the self and the experience of the outside world. It refers to the function of the personality by means of which the origins of intrapsychic experience can be differential according to whether it sums from the inside fantasy, memory, or from the outside. So you're seeing this sort of tension between the inside and the outside that Kernberg's referring to. And I think this gets at the heart of what gender identity disturbance really is about. It's about sort of this tension between what someone feels on the inside and the contact that they're receiving from the outside, or how uncomfortable they feel on the outside. Winnicott is another famous object relations theorist. This is simply another paper to sort of anchor the idea that there is a tension between the internal sense of self and contact with the external world as sort of organizing that sense of self. And this is really at the heart of what gender identity diffusion has as its sort of organizing aspect, that we can think about how this gender identity diffusion or confusion arises. And there's a recent paper that many of you might find of interest by Lopez and Wortman, Gender is the New Language of Teen Rebellion. So Dr. Levine talked a little bit about adolescents going through identity crisis, and here's one way of framing gender identity. It's this new way of rebelling. This tension between the inside and the outside becomes sort of a vehicle by which gender identity can be used to sort of navigate that world. So a little bit about the mechanics about what defines personality disorder, and this is a little bit of background into sort of the academy and the way some of gender identity disturbance is being legitimized or fought politically in the academy via the DSM and how we define personality disorder. So personality dysfunction is really the core of personality disorder, or personality psychopathology as I like to refer to it, because I don't see the personality disorders necessarily as categorical. It's a dimensional level of psychopathology. You can have more or less personality disturbance. And then you have personality traits or styles. So this is more or less the sort of extension of the big five personality traits and how this relates to maladaptive functioning. But it's really personality dysfunction that is the core of really what personality psychopathology is defined by. And so there's a lot of nosological or diagnostic issues going on in the academy right now that really get at the heart of how gender identity is being traversed or managed in sort of the academic theoretical framework. So you have the DSM, of course, and you have what's called now this alternative model of personality disorders, which is being used increasingly and pushed by clinicians and researchers, researchers mainly, because they see things dimensionally, not as categorically. And there's two criterions by which clinicians can use this new alternative model of personality disorders. Criterion A and criterion B. And I don't want you to get lost in the weeds of some of this diagnostic stuff, but just remember that criterion A is really the level of personality functioning that defines that personality dysfunction. Criterion B is just how they express it. And so there's a lot of people in the academy that are fighting between, well, what's more important, criterion A or criterion B? And the ones that want to do away with criterion A don't really believe that personality dysfunction is at the core of personality psychopathology. So they just want to focus on the expression of the styles. But criterion A is really what's measuring that dysfunction. So the experience of oneself is unique, clear boundaries, sense of continuity, and so forth. And it doesn't measure the traits or the expression. So it's the core element of the personality diagnosis. And here you can see a little slide on the right side is really the core of how you might score somebody who has an identity that is very, disordered or problematic. And you can see a score of 4, extreme impairment, and you can see what that would reflect. Experience of a unique self and sense of agency is really lost, has weak or distorted self-image, and so forth. And so criterion A and criterion B, you can think on the right side is criterion A is global dysfunction. That's the core of personality dysfunction, and criterion B is simply how that gets expressed. And of course, you have your clusters of personality disorders. And for gender identity, the ones that seem to be the most, that come up the most often are cluster B disorders. So antisocial, borderline especially, narcissism, and histrionic personality disorder. And those are the ones that are going to have styles that overlap with a lot of how gender identity disturbance is displayed. And here you can see the prevalence. The point of this slide is just to show you that there's different prevalence of these different clusters. And cluster B has a certain prevalence compared to cluster A. And what you can see is cluster B is a little bit less than the others. And so it's a more unique temperamental or personality style. And there's also comorbidity of these personality issues with mood disturbance. And this is going to be a key component of gender identity disturbance, because in the theoretical framework that I want to present, you have this mood disturbance that is really at the core of what the gender identity disturbance is really manifested in. So you have sadness or anxiety or confusion about oneself, and gender identity becomes the way you can sort of navigate that. And of course, in the DSM, there's a lot of politics, as was mentioned in the last talk, one of the questioners. So what they've done in the new DSM is reduced gender identity, done away with it, and that really eliminated the concept of identity from gender identity disorder. It became gender dysphoria. So that personality aspect was sort of done away with, at least in a formal sense. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. And so a couple of papers that articulate just how that was done. So you have a little of the background and mechanics into why that was done and what was taken away. And you can think of gender identity disturbance as personality psychopathology in my estimation. And so you can see that there is a lot of overlap between individuals who come into the clinic, but who also are diagnosed with personality disorders as well, including the cluster Bs that come up quite a bit. And so there's different rates, but some of the most recent papers, this one from 2025 and another meta-analysis, show you that there's a lot of those overlaps. Neurodivergence, which is another sort of politicized area, is just simply another way in which these identities are proliferating. And neurodivergence, we've talked about autism earlier, it's sort of an offshoot of autism. But what it is it's taking identities from autism and making them sort of the purchase that one can have as these new identities, rather than something that's intrinsically problematic about the personality. So the neurodiversity movement, for those of you that may not know, has its origins in queer theory. It comes out of the roots of some of the gender identity and the transgender activism framework. And so in the second aspect of neurodiversity is what you end up with is disability as identity, much like you have gender disturbance as identity, or a new gender as identity. Now you have neurodivergence or disability. And so it's the same proliferation. You're fragmenting all these different senses of self into these new identities. And so what's really the core, the developmental process that I think is happening here? Well, I'm outlining it in a little bit of few slides, a little flow guide here. You obviously have genetic vulnerability, so you have trait styles that can be elevated in a genetic sense. You have the environment that obviously plays a role, and that would be the focus of early object relations theorists and so forth. And then you have mood disorder that comes about because of those two things. And the way that mood disorder gets expressed via social media, and this is where social media comes in my opinion, is that when you have mood disorder, or when you have this confusion, this identity diffusion, where do you go to find your niche for people that will affirm that? It's increasingly becoming social media. And once you have that full immersion into the identity, you can then become the new gender, or the new neurodivergent identity, or the new queer identity. And that includes full immersion. And this is where you see the harm starting to come about, because if you're in these niches constantly, you're constantly affirmed, you end up with obviously body modification, and the identity, the maladaptive identity, or the identity that's not coherent, becomes totally fixed and increasingly unable to alteration. You have attachment, which is sort of an object relations offshoot. It obviously deals with the caregiver relationship. And one of the aspects of attachment that I think informs the gender identity conversation is that patterns of affect and regulation become established. And one of the patterns of attachment, and certainly if you're interested in this, you can reach out to me, is this type C pattern, which is a resistant, petulant type of attachment. And what you see in type C attachment is the individuals who are anxiously attached to their parents for a number of different reasons. They display behavior that exaggerates and alternates display of anger and desire for comfort with some fear. And I think that's really what defines a lot of gender identity confused individuals. They're angry, they're confused, they're fearful, but that becomes a way to manage their affect. And so in these high type C strategies, and this is simply from one way you can look at attachment and you can code it and you can think about it, the individual is really angry. They want revenge. And so you end up with their patterns of affect are focused around that, getting revenge or using emotional blackmail to maintain a relationship. And that's one of the things that you will often see with the gender identity individuals, is they're using anger, their confusion in the service of maintaining a desire for closeness and comfort that has otherwise escaped them in early relationships for some reason. So their style of discourse, if you interviewed some of these people, reflects the usual cognitive structures, but things get inverted. So you have what's called false cognition, emotional manipulation, emotional blackmail to get what they want. And so you can see one of the ways that we can think about this is through the way they talk about things. And here's a good example. I told you that my family conflict is all about me. And they use it in the service of manipulating the service of getting that gender identity reified or affirmed. And so some more papers articulating that. Here was a great essay that I just read about how transgender activists can display this affect, skip about, they're babyish, they're coy, and they use that in the service of their identity to manipulate. The suicide narrative is a good example of that. I've termed it the grotesque lie. It's, again, another way of an emotional manipulation to get what they want to affirm the identity. And you can see that once you control for other mood disturbance, transgender individuals are not really at higher rates for suicide and so forth. But to finish, and I want to run through these rather quickly, I know I'm short on time, the role of social media. So this is really where the fragmented self is becoming problematic. Social media is allowing these niches to become places where these fragmented identities can become reified, affirmed, and affirmed, and affirmed. So the socializing muscle in the external world that the early objects relations theorists might have talked about has become weakened. You're totally mediated online. The identities get reaffirmed. So who am we? And Sherry Turkle. That's really where you end up. Who am we? You're a product of the fandom. And Sherry Turkle, who was an early person who looked at social media and life on the screen, basically talked about these ways in which postmodern sensibilities give rise to choosing identities at will and affirming them and living them as if there's no contact with the external world. So Plurals, another good one, dissociative identity disorder. People just have all these different ways of identifying, different personalities. And here you can see a few clips from TikTok that illustrate this. See if they play. These were meant to play, but you can go on TikTok and you can see these. These people just talk about different identities, and it's a performative aspect. And you can see many papers about this, but again, it's just the proliferation of identity. And so Marshall McLuhan, who is a major sort of media theorizer, the medium is the message. And that's really what social media has become for gender identity, a larger fragmented identity problem. So that's where I want to end up. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to talk with any of you more about this, but really what I want to emphasize is how social media is proliferating the identities that one can choose from. It's affirming them, and there's never any contact with the external world. So that personality dysfunction becomes basically fixed via social media. And so that's why it's important in the case of what Dr. Levin mentioned, is to find ways to connect gender identity confused individuals with the outside world in the form of a therapist, a coach, a mentor, etc. So thank you. Happy to take questions as well.
We're gonna, two questions, okay. Sorry, that's okay. We have a question right here.
Hi, thanks very much. My name's Sandy. I'm a doctoral student. One of my colleagues is looking at how young people are engaging in therapy with generative AI tools. And I wondered if you could speak to that in terms of the fact that it draws from what's online. And yeah, I think it's quite a scary prospect, but.
That's really a great question, because as I was updating my slide deck and presentation, just recently, within the last couple of months, there's been talk about this sort of AI psychosis, where people are getting in these relationships with AI chatbots, and that's leading to even further fragmentation or reification of mental health issues, identity issues. So as far as therapy with AI, I'm I guess ambivalent about it. I think it might sort of reinforce the issue of being online with a socially mediated object person rather than a real person in the world. And that's really what this issue, I think, is about. Everything is now mediated through the screen, through a social media presence, and not in the real environment that early object relations theorists were referring to, where you're out in the world playing sports and you're having contact, or you're in your peer group. And so I would be a little bit ambivalent about that. But I'm not a clinician, so I really can't say for sure.
Okay, here's our final question.
Hi, I'm Larry. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I'd like to quibble a little bit about the kids not testing their personality in the real world. Most of the kids I see have in fact tested their personality in the real world and found themselves sorely lacking, and that's one of the reasons why they go deeply into social media. So I think it's sort of a both thing. I think we really need to pay a lot of attention to improving the social world that these kids find themselves in.
Yeah, and I think that illustrates the tension. So I think the social world is important, because if the child is in the social world and they find their personality pushed back against, or that's why they go online, that's signaling something important to them that they need to navigate in the real world rather than going online to find a place. So in other words, they need to deal with that conflict in a way that is probably more hard than going online to find some place where it can just be affirmed. You need to work through that rather than not work through that and go to a place where you know you don't have to work through that. So that conflict has to be navigated in the real world. And sort of that sort of negative affect that might come about that's important for these kids to experience so they can learn to tolerate and metabolize it, rather than just not have to deal with it by going into a fandom where they can get affirmation after affirmation.